but the title for this presentation is Consciousness, Imagination, and Gratitude, the Inexhaustible Sources of the Self. Trying to be in line with the notion of boundless human potential. Fascinating topic. And, one that I consider quite opposite to the work, life, vision, way of seeing of Ibn Arabi. And I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to be here, to be with this group, which is an entity in the intellectual history of the latter half of the 20th century. We're now in the 21st century. I keep having to remind myself. Which has done more for the study of Ibn Arabi than any other, without question. I mean, it's obvious, but I'd just like to beg your indulgence for the opportunity to say that while here, inside the Kaaba, which is a spectacular structure for such a meeting. It's just been uninterrupted pleasure from the moment we started, and now it will all change, of course. but it is wonderful to be here with you. I'm going to speak about Ibn Arabi in a general way and in a specific way. And in the general way, it is part of my favorite theme, and it's the problem and topic and question which got me interested in Islamic studies to begin with. That is the heritage of Islam in the contemporary modern situation. That is to say, the gift of what Hodgson referred to as the venture of Islam to human civilization. This I find the most compelling aspect of the study for myself. Not to say that other aspects aren't extremely compelling, but this I find is an urgent question, because as a race, namely the human race, we are largely, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, Western, Eastern, largely unaware of the great gift of this cultural efflorescence effect it has had on our, especially Western, science, knowledge, institution building, the idea of the university, public hygiene, teaching hospitals. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The saving of the Greek tradition, I mean, is just endless. And I won't try and present a list of these things, but what I want to do is share with you my excitement and enthusiasm about this historical reality and my shall we say, restiveness of fact this remains still largely unknown. I got into Islamic studies as an undergraduate when I was studying English to perhaps become a lawyer. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I had to take a course, a breadth requirement course. I was flipping through the catalog, and there was a course called The Heritage of Islam. Quite apart from not knowing anything about Islam, I had no idea of a heritage of any kind. Because I am a North American, probably much different in Europe, although maybe not a lot. But all through school, we've never heard the word Muhammad or Islam or the Quran, not once in any class, ever. Wallahi. Nothing. And so at university, I decided to look into this course, and it was like first looking into Chapman's Homer, or it was a thrill that I still live with. And then the question that followed was, why have they been keeping this such a big secret? And over the last 35 years or so, I've tried to evolve responses to that question, try to understand it, but more than to understand why, I'm trying to redress it on my own sort of personal mission. Well, of course, it's not just my mission. There are many people also involved in doing this. But it's an urgent problem. It's an emergency. Because until at least Europe and Atlantic nations and North American recognize that in their cultural DNA there is a large component of Islam and Islamic culture, the resistance and phobia about Islam will continue, because it is a matter of self-denial. It's a psychological problem on a global scale, and it is one of the ways in which this issue can be addressed is by painstakingly sharing the great cultural and spiritual and intellectual achievements of the Islamic world with the broader global world, with the world as it is today. And this, of course, is where our master, Ibn al-Arabi, enters the picture. He's not the only one, of course. He's not the only impressive spiritual genius from Islamic culture. But I think it is safe to say, and it's been said by many people, that there is probably no greater spiritual genius in the history of Islam, and maybe even in the history of mysticism in general. Right? What frequently happens, as we all know, is that because it's mysticism, Ibn Arabi is oftentimes looked at as an erratic boulder, as yes, he's from a Muslim society, but that's where it begins and ends. Not really a Muslim, and this is not Islam, right? This is mysticism, okay? And therefore, we can proceed to feel very good about, again, because we have this wired-in phobia, a word which means fear and hate at the same time. We have this phobia about Islam. And so Ibn Arabi, from the point of view of being a mystic, is taken to our breast and loved and cherished and enthused over and written about and translated. And the Islamic part is sometimes left to one side. Well, I'm here to tell you that that to be fair, I think, I sincerely believe that Ibn Arabi spins in his grave when this happens, right? I believe that he was a devout Muslim and proud and importantly attached to this identity, and that for him to be separated from Islam would be an act of violence. This is I sense this. I feel this. We can discuss it if there's time here. Which I will eventually stop talking, of course. If there's time here or in the seminar, we can. I would be happy and welcome the opportunity to discuss these ideas with you, because that's also one of the great privileges of being here, is you actually meet people who are interested in the same thing you are and have deeply held, existentially engaged views, not just scholarship, not just academic credentials, but people for whom these questions are truly important. So that then something can happen, right? Then we can make some progress together. All right. What time shall I stop?
About 12.
Okay. To begin with the first category, consciousness. This will cover a certain amount of territory. I'd like to return to this issue of Ibn Arabi and Islam. For everyone who's read, looked at Ibn Arabi, especially in Arabic, but in good translations and editions, it's also quite clear that frequently every other word is from the Quran. Right? That this is the pole around which he circumambulates. It is his bride, in a sense. It's part of himself. He himself says these things on several occasions. And the beautiful book by Shodkovitz, The Ocean Without Shore, is a wonderful demonstration of this reality, this bonding. In a sense, everything, and this has also been said, but everything that he's written is kind of a commentary on the Quran or a response to it. And then it behooves us to have some insight into what the Quran is in its pre-Ibn Arabi state, to have a look at it for what it is and what it says. And I just want to focus on one or two topics from the Quran which relate to some of the ideas that have been expressed here in the past couple of days. And that is the idea of, where's Nick? Beautiful paper. The idea of the meta-narrative from the point of view of Ken Wilber. Well, in your talk, it was quite clear that the Quran actually does provide a meta-narrative. We speak today about human rights and human relations and the human heritage and all the rest of it. And while it's not the first place in the world where the category was mentioned, the Quran may be seen as the place in which the idea of humanity was actually born. All right? The idea of humanity that is not a chosen people or a tribal people, not Arab, not Persian, but humanity. You read the Quran, frequent leitmotif, even more frequent than a leitmotif, is this notion of humanity, mankind. Mankind were this, and then this happened. Or humanity was this. For those men who have eyes, it's de-ethnicized. It's humanity in a not abstract form, but in a pure phenomenological form. This is magnificent development in the history of ideas and in the history of religion. And not only this, the Quran says that humanity could have been all one community. We all know the famous verse. But God decided to do things otherwise. It wasn't all one community. Divided people into different groups, in different colors, with different languages, different nations, different tribes, different races, for one particular reason. And of course, the reason comes sometimes later in the book. This is one of the beauties of the Quran. It is very interesting from the point of view of structure. Who knows the reason for all of these various tribes and languages and colors and races and so on? Anybody? I like a little audience participation. Yeah. Sir?
To know each other.
Ah, thank you very much. La ta'arafu. That they might actually share. And this verb in Arabic is extremely important because it's of a special verbal form. In Arabic, it has a special form for every mood and every nuance in the verb. So this is a verb of mutuality. Ta'arafa, right? So all of these different cultures exist so that each can have the experience, the mutual experience of recognition. This sounds terribly postmodern to me. And it's from the 7th century. It wasn't in order that some may be distinguished as more excellent than the others, or that some be seen as more dangerous than the others, or some should be avoided. It's so that all could have the experience of recognizing and getting to know each other. And the verb, ta'arifa, is built on this important verb in Arabic, arafa, the one that generates the great hadith, man arafa nafsuhu. He who knows himself knows his Lord, right? It's the same verbal idea. And actually, arafa doesn't mean know in the same way that other verbs mean know. It means to recognize, right? So who recognizes the true self also recognizes the God. And now we're getting closer to the centerpiece of the brief discussion of consciousness. The idea of dhikr is extremely important in the Islamic tradition. It has become somewhat monopolized, at least in the scholarly literature, by Sufis, but this is not true. Muslims in general are engaged in dhikr. It is not just a Sufi domain. The word dhikr means to mention with accent and emphasis on the ment part, the mentation idea, not the tongue idea, that is brought to mind, right? And of course, you know the mind in the Quran is the heart, right? It's quite common in the time and place, and the heart it's actually almost the center, as Behan was speaking the other day. The mind is here. The Greeks put the mind in the head because they were clever architects, and they knew that the head was a sphere, which is the strongest architectural structure. So they wanted to protect it. But prior to this, and even coeval with it, the heart in other cultures was here, right? The mind and the heart are the same, right? And there are various other regions that do other sort of acts of cognition and perception in different ways, but it is the heart in the Quran. Okay, so the heart, the idea of mentation, bringing to mind, is, yes, to remember God, but to remember something very special vis-a-vis God. It's not just to remember God, because what's that? God is unknowable. Isn't it wonderful? You know, you can never know God. God is beyond everything. God is unknowable. Laisa kamithlihi shay'. Not only is nothing like him, nothing is like him, right? In the Quran. You say it's utterly remote, utterly removed, God. So how do you remember this? How do you bring it to mind? You know, what's going on? This is a perfect example of the kind of play between oppositions and dualities and symmetries in the Quran, which makes it so powerful. The power of the text. Well, we're given a clue, and most agree, and Bovering demonstrated this in his great book on Tustori about 30 years ago, that probably what we're thinking about here is that important moment called the Day of the Covenant in the Quran, at Surah 7, verse 172. Okay. When God enters the stage of conceptualization in a sort of mythic drama, or mythopoeic drama, and on the plane of no time and no place, and takes from the loins of Adam the potential, the seeds, the potentia of all future generations of human beings. And they are arrayed on this great plane of timelessness and placelessness, because it's before creation. And God addresses them with these words, "Am I not your Lord?" And they all immediately respond, "Yea, verily, Ba'Allah." Right? And this is the scenario. This is the beginning of time according to Islam. Compare the beginning of time here with the beginning of time in other traditions. Right? Here we have the entire human race, Arab, Muslim, Republican, Democrat. They're all here. And they all share in this experience. And they are brought into reality through this divine questioning. They didn't exist prior to the question. It's akin to the Kuntu Kanzan hadith, right? I was a hidden treasure and I desired to be. It's sort of the obverse of that in a sense, right? It represents the establishment of the covenant in Islam. And the covenant, of course, is an important word in Abrahamic religious tradition. It's not so, it doesn't thrill people from other traditions quite so much, because it is a specific word having to do with a specific mercantile culture in which covenants and agreements were made, or selling and buying, and so on. Muhammad continues this. The Quran continues the importance of the idea of the covenant. By this time it has a very ancient, venerable pedigree, and this is the day of the covenant. There are two words for covenant in Arabic, and they're extremely important. They're at the center of Islamic thought and life, and they were at the center of Ibn Arabi's thought and life. This drama, this myth, sacred myth, represents, of course, the notion of obedience, because it goes on in the same verses. The reason that we've done this is so that on the day of judgment, no one will be able to say, "Oh, I didn't know we were supposed to behave." I mean, after all, it was my parents who led me into that. Are you going to blame me for my parents? Right? So that's the reason given in the Quran, right? And no one's arguing, of course, with the Quran. But what it represents from another point of view, from the sort of mystical and, if you like, philosophical point of view, and even from maybe a literary point of view, is an Islamic myth of the birth of consciousness. This consciousness is not undifferentiated and amorphous. It's not just a blank tabula rasa. It is a consciousness which comes into existence already with these presuppositions about humanity and relationship to God and the overlordship of God and the servitude of humanity, and this relationship which is more important than anything else in creation because it precedes creation. Right? This is why we are here. Right? So this is the consciousness aspect of the talk that I wanted to speak about. And I think that it's something that we need to be reminded of, no pun intended, because it is a quintessentially Islamicate idea. It doesn't exist like this in other traditions, right? This is part of the heritage of Islam. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but we have to know that this is one of the gifts from the Islamic religious and cultural world to us. It's now part of our common language, and if it's not, it should be. It should be a topic that we are all familiar with as citizens of the world, right? So now we'll look at the idea of imagination. An idea very important, as we all know, to Ibn Arabi. And something, and the contribution from Ibn Arabi to the discourse of imagination in Islamic thought is unparalleled. It's quite original. There may be intimations of its flowering earlier and so on, but he is really the master of this discourse of imagination. And one of the places where he speaks about it and shall we say, the place that I'm going to refer to, because he's written so much, and there's so much out there, and I don't present myself as an expert on the writings of Ibn Arabi, but I do know some of his works and some of his ideas, and as I said, I like to relate his entire project to the Islamic cultural fact. Is in the Fusus, in his, he speaks about it to some degree in the Fas on Isaac, but more importantly maybe in the discussion of Joseph. And of course, when Joseph enters the picture, it deserves and demands a bit of elaboration and discussion, because Joseph is another, the Islamic Joseph is another sui generis gift from Islam to the world of religio, cultural, psychological, poetic discourse that has not really been taken to the bosom of shall we say, comparative literature or comparative religion to the degree that it should. It's coming more and more. But the Islamic Joseph is really quite remarkable and demands some special respect and attention. So I'll talk a little bit about Joseph and then about the doctrine of imagination that is involved in Ibn Arabi's discussion of him in the Fusus. Again, when you bring up the question of the Fusus, the idea of meta-narrative returns. Because the Fusus is mature work of Ibn Arabi. For a long time it was the only thing that was read. And some people decried this. If it were the only thing that we had from him, it wouldn't be the end of the world, shall we say. It is a magnificent, mature composition that seems to say most, if not everything, what he wanted to say to us, even if we cannot, even if the details are sometimes hard to perceive. It's tremendous. And I know that it's like preaching to the choir or carrying coals to Newcastle or something here, but indulge me for a minute, because I would like to just tell you about my enthusiasm about just the title for this book, the Fusus al-Hikam. We all know that it's an image about a ring and a ringstone, right? The fas is the setting of the gemstone, right? And the gemstone is the different gem, different color. The different treatments in the various chapters represent the different colors of a gem. They correspond to this idea. But the fas is also important, right? Because the fas is the actual prophetic self to which the light of this wisdom occurs. So you have the gem, which is the knowledge or the wisdom, and its variegated nature, its differentiation from another wisdom, and then you have the fas, which, if we refer to gemology at the time that Ibn Arabi was written, and the making of rings and jewelry and so on, which wasn't quite as, it was much different than the way it wasn't quite as possible to fashion a jewel the way we can today. We can't cut, so the fas had to be fitted to the jewel. So this is the part of the metaphor that I'd like to stress, is that the importance of the defining metaphor in this title is that each prophet is a distinct individual and is shaped by the wisdom that comes to it. Right? This is terribly important. That is, who he was. And then we get into notions of context and history and society and language and all of these things. In addition to the Quranic invention of humanity, we also want to bear in mind that the Islamic tradition recognizes many more prophets than the 27 or 28 6 or however many there are mentioned in the Quran. The number is, sir, how many? Thank you very much. 124,000 prophets. We don't know them all. But why does this make sense? They weren't all from Babylon. The Quran says that there is no community on the face of the earth that lives now or that has ever lived that has not had the benefit of divine revelation through a prophetic messenger. This wipes away the whole possibility of anything approaching a chosen people. I mean, there are Muslim missionaries. There is a da'wah. There is a call. There is a mission. And there is preaching and sometimes proselytization. But according to the Quran, it's not possible to see any other person on the face of the earth as less than you are. There may be the unregenerate, as spoken of in various aspects, and sometimes in highly polemical situations. And I would caution us to make sure that when we find these intense statements about non-human, look for the politics of the polemics involved, what's going on, because it is quite common. But in general, the Quranic position is that there is no people on the face of the earth that has been without divine guidance. They may have forgotten it. They may have killed their prophet. Frequently they do these things, according to the Quran. They disobey. And, of course, the degree to which the prophets are followed or not followed in the Quran is one of the elements in the development of civilization. Civilizations that flourish represent a people that, to a greater or lesser degree, obeyed and recognized the prophet that was sent to them. Civilizations that did not flourish represent the opposite, a people to whom a prophet came and was utterly rejected by the majority. So this is the Quranic equation. And by this, another element of the Quranic heritage is brought forth, that is, namely, in the Quran, civilization itself is raised to the level of religious value. Right. And you see, we don't hear this from anybody, and we don't get it. But it is absolutely essential to recognize that the whole struggle, and for the seminar, I'm sharing with you an article. No, it's not that one, sorry. The whole struggle in Islam may be compared as an epic battle or epic journey from ignorance, jahal, to its opposite, which in the Quran, jahal is what? Ignorance? Right. The opposite of jahal in the Quran is Islam. Islam. We have the Jahili period, and we have the Islamic period, right? So, whereas technically, from the point of view of the dictionary, jahal would be expected to be, the opposite would expect to be knowledge, or ilm. In reality, in the Quranic and Islamic synthesis, the opposite of jahal is Islam, which automatically, therefore, means civilization and enlightenment, right? So this is another aspect of Islamic consciousness. So these prophets are all purveyors of civilization. Part of their struggle, part of their mission was through this divine wisdom, action was to be instituted, civilizational action, in which people were taught to live more justly, more harmoniously, more perfectly, fulfilling more perfectly their human potential. This is the case for all of them. But you will also notice in the Fusus that whenever possible and whenever apposite, Ibn Arabi points out that no matter how brilliant or great the particular prophet was, Muhammad is more accomplished. Right? And this is an important part of his mission because he wishes to show that Muhammad encompasses all of the wisdoms of the previous prophets. It's not to denigrate the previous prophet, but it's to demonstrate the great faith and certitude he has about the Quranic revelation. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it, but this is who Ibn Arabi at least wishes to be seen as in the Fusus. Ultimately, those prophets represent for me a sacred alphabet of culture and civilization. Notice there are almost as many as there are letters in the alphabet, in the Fusus. They had almost, except for, maybe, I don't know, what are they, 26 or 27? And so, the 28, the last one being Hu. So it wouldn't be seemly to have someone representing Hu, which is the unknowable Huwa, right? God. Wa is the symbol. But if we think of these prophets as the sort of functioning alphabet of spiritual civilization, I think we come close to what Ibn Arabi wishes to tell us. And I think that if he were living today and talking with Ken Wilber, he would say, well, you don't have to go very far for a meta-narrative. We have an example here in the Quran and in my own work on the Quran, right? So I'm happy to share it with you, right? Right. So, what about Joseph? Let us see. Oh dear. Well, let me take care of the last part now because that's the shortest part. And the idea of gratitude is not the least important part, but it's the briefest part. In these polemical situations that exist in all human societies, these contests for who's right and who's wrong, I think Ibn Arabi has a position, even though he does seem to take a position from time to time, but I think he wants us to meditate on the question of what is so important about being right. Yeah, it's not that it shouldn't be important, but you should know what is important about being right, and therefore what is undesirable about being wrong. It's a critique of this kind of position, because prior, this is more Wilburian perhaps than Ibn Arabian, but prior to, say, the contemporary world, the post-industrial, post-enlightenment world, and unfortunately the traces of this still are with us, in order to be right, someone has to be wrong. This was the only way of conceptualizing it. Right? This is where the ideas probably emerged. But we now know that this is unsatisfactory. Even if we don't know how to logically elaborate an alternative view, we know from our experience, and this is one of the features of postmodernism that maybe is not so gloomy. But we now know that there are so many different views in the world, it's fallacious, ipso facto, to base being right on the postulate that others have to be wrong. We know this now. I think Ibn Arabi's work points in this direction, if it doesn't say so explicitly. In any case, the idea of gratitude is taken from the opposite notion, ingratitude, which is one of the translations for this word you hear frequently, a Quranic word, kufr or kafir. The word kufr means in its first instance to be ungrateful. To be ungrateful, and in this instance, for the message which is coming from God. It does mean other things, but in its first instance, according to the etymologists of the Islamic tradition, it means ingratitude, to cover up your source, to hide who you're stealing from in your publications. This is kufr, to be so small-souled that you're unable to say thank you for this idea. This is kufr. To say thank you for this is a gift As I said, when I was at the first Ibn Arabi meeting in California Nick was there, so I'm sorry to bore you with some of the same stuff. I'm a great fan of the terrific book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift, in which he goes through the notion of, not from an anthropological way, but from sort of a spiritual, poetic way. The conclusion of his wonderful discussion, which has a lot to do with the poetry of Ezra Pound, as it happens, which is a great way to reread Ezra Pound, is that the greatest gift is, in fact, gratitude. The feeling of gratitude is a wonderful bounty, right? So I think that this has great relevance to the notion of kafir and Muslim. Yes, a Muslim is one who has submitted to the law, but also a Muslim is one who demonstrates their gratitude for the law, and the kafir is one who is not grateful. So this was just, I wanted to add this to the other two things because I think this sets the tone of what I wanted to share with you under the other two categories. And all three of these things I see as sources of the self, or what is frequently talked about in religious studies literature, the constituents of the formation of a soul in a particular tradition. This is a glimpse into how the soul is formed. If you like, the Islamicate soul, right? Or the Muslim soul, but that gets a little too intimate. I would not dare to speak about the Muslim soul. But the notion of soul is built upon consciousness, imagination, sometimes ignored, but it's a sacred obligation, and gratitude. And the idea of them being sources of the self is, I'm stealing from the title of the great monumental book by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, The Sources of the Self in the Modern Period, which he tries to understand the sources of the Western or European self, what they are. Religion, of course, has a great deal to do with it, political institutions and all the rest of it. But in the Islamicate abstract, these are sources of the self. And they shed light on, I think, the writings of Ibn Arabi. So who is Joseph? A singular self in the Islamic tradition, an exemplary prophet for the way he addressed the various challenges that he met in his life, very serious ones. But what is important here, Ibn Arabi, in the Fusus, it's wonderful. The chapter is 111 verses long, and it's one of the most dramatic, operatic surahs in the Quran. So much is going on. It's very exciting. Everybody loves it just for the story aspect. So much do they love it for the story aspect that the early Kharijites said, this can't be part of the Quran. It's first of all, it's the only coherent surah, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this can't be Quranic, they said. So they suggested that it was tarif, but it is in the Quran, and it's a magnificent story. And we don't have time to relate the whole thing here. I will talk about one or two episodes that are essential. But Ibn Arabi, in a masterful gesture of concision and authority, just quotes one or two verses, virtually the first one and the last one. Because what he wants to say is connected with this. It's not really the first one, it's the second or third, but it's the last. It's the beginning and the end, shall we say. It begins with a recount of Joseph's dream, seeing the 12 stars bowing down to him. Right? And Ibn Arabi, in a space of a small paragraph, infers the entire story by saying, and at the end, we have this verse. What he wants to tell us is that the dream, the vision, which is a product of the imagination, through history, through the story of Joseph and through his epic struggle, through his role as the expeditionary soul, I loved that yesterday, brought about, through the grace of God, the actual reality of his dream. The dream showed him being his brothers and his father and his stepmother bowing down to him. And the story, of course, is all about how the brothers wanted anything but that to happen. They were already terribly annoyed by Joseph. He was beautiful. His father loved him, giving this very fancy, expensive coat with all the colors. You know, to have a coat with a lot of colors in those days meant serious investment, right? It was not just, here, have my shirt. You know, it was a serious distinction for Joseph to be given this magnificent coat, which is referred to elusively in the Quran as the kameez, the shirt, right? But it is phenomenologically the same thing. You know, so they took him out and, you know, did away with him, dropped him down a well, and then finally sold him into slavery. And then he went to Egypt and had the run-in with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife and his great resistance to her. But even though he was innocent, he was jailed anyway. And this is not unfamiliar, right? Yeah, he was a Hebrew slave. What else do you do with an uppity Hebrew slave? Throw him in jail. You know, they can't be innocent, no matter if they didn't do the crime. They are ontologically guilty, right? So this is a Hebrew slave, put him in jail, right? The nerve of him inciting the lust of Potiphar's otherwise stainless wife. We get rid of this man. So he languished in prison for all those years, and it was in prison again that his powers of imagination were discovered and brought to the attention of the king, for whom he interpreted the king's dreams. And as a result of his great ability to do this, he was released from prison after a long ordeal and given this high position in the land. So his dream is coming true. But it doesn't come all together true until, lo and behold, on the horizon we see these brothers coming to town because Canaan is in a terrible drought, terrible famine. And they've come. Jacob sent them down to Egypt to borrow some wheat, to get some wheat. And so they come and they're taken to Joseph, and they don't recognize him, right? Not immediately. And so they are in the dramatically ironic position of begging from the one they despised and, in fact, would have killed if it hadn't been for one of them who saved his life, right? They were out of jealousy and hatred and sibling rivalry to a high degree. All right? Well, we're running out of time, right? 5 minutes, okay. So. Well, most of us know the story. I want to concentrate on one aspect of it, which has to do with, again, the shirt. If you read the surah and track the appearances of the shirt, which occurs in various contexts throughout the surah, it provides also another way of tracking the narrative unity of the story, and it's very revealing about what the Quran is saying here. But in the ultimate appearance of the shirt, we have the situation which Jacob, the father of Joseph, and the father of Benjamin. Jacob and Benjamin were two full brothers, and so Jacob's love for them was more or less equal, though Joseph was the older one. Jacob has, by this time, from weeping for the loss of these two sons, the feared loss of Benjamin, with such strength and power that his tears have washed the sight from his eyes. Right. That's the Quran, you know. And he's languishing on his bed back in Canaan land, and all of his sons, all of his progeny, and he's a prophet, remember, he's a patriarch. All of his sons are now gone. They're down there in Egypt, which of course means bad place. That's a code word for bad place in the Bible. Egypt land, right? They're all down there, and God knows what's going on. So he's languishing there. And it's very cinematic. Jacob, after forgiving his brothers, he was the most powerful man in Egypt. He could have had them ground up into hamburger if he wanted to. And nobody would have blamed him for what they... And this is a very important lesson about Islamic prophetology and prophethood. Joseph is seen here in this light in such glowing terms. He forgives them, not with first having a little fun with them, letting them know that he knows, that they know, etc., etc. But he says, go back to Canaan and bring the rest of the family here, and we'll all live here. But he's learned about the blindness of his father, and he said, oh, take this shirt, and when you're back home, put it on my father's eyes so he can get his sight back. All right, so they take the shirt, they load up the camels, and the Quran says, as soon as they cross the border of Egypt into Canaan, Jacob raises up in bed and says, I detect the scent of Joseph. Even though these people here think I'm crazy, the Quran says. It's magnificent. And this is the powerful notion of the spiritual value of aroma, the metaphorical nature of aroma. Aroma is extremely important because it simultaneously represents presence and absence. Right? And so it's a beautiful spiritual metaphor. It does this, and also aroma goes straight to the brain. It's the only sensory stimulant that does that. Everything else is mediated. It goes straight to the brain without the nervous system. They go back to Canaan. They take the shirt. The messenger of good news, the Bashir, Bashara, goes into the home of Jacob and lays the shirt on him. His sight is given back to him. He can see. The entire family goes down to Egypt to live more or less happily ever after until Moses' time. And then the Quran ends by Joseph saying, this is the fulfillment of my dream, my original dream. So this is kind of an epic of the imagination. And Ibn Arabi says that, the entire experience is imagination in this surah of Joseph, and that we are involved in a cosmos which is imagination, yet we are also given our own autonomous powers of imagination. It's sort of a large imagination and a small, and these two things interact. Said nowhere more better than in the opening of Fas of Adam, where this one phrase is just, I think, encapsulates so much of what Ibn Arabi wants to say when he says that God describes himself and the world to us through us. It's extremely important, right? And it's not encountered in that way elsewhere. That we are part of the medium, part of the message. We are part of the description, part of the describer, and it's this meshing of the imaginal. But we are still charged with our own autonomy, our own responsibility, which is symbolized by the law and the Sharia and all of these things, and our own effort, our himma, to continue to fight against the lower nafs and to try and bring out what is best in us, so that the imagination can ultimately serve as a light. Like the light which is the essence of God, which we heard about so beautifully in the presentation. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The imagination from the Fas of Joseph by Ibn Arabi, it seems to me that Ibn Arabi wishes to tell us that this is an auxiliary light. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went over.
Indifferent.